Not all monsters are make-believe. Some are real, hiding in plain sight, wearing the masks of fathers, friends, or neighbors. Tonight, we will take you on a journey, a story based on true events. It's a chilling tale of hardship, resilience, and the strength it takes to confront the darkness in our lives, and sometimes within ourselves. This is not just a horror story, it's a story about survival, about finding hope in the face of unimaginable cruelty. A reminder that even in the deepest shadows, there's a spark of light. But beware, this isn't for the faint of heart. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon for more stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. And now, let's uncover the truth behind the darkness.
Not all monsters are make-believe. Some exist, and some even live within your own family. The house was always cold, even in summer. The kind of chill that seeped into your bones, clung to your skin, and whispered that this was no place for warmth. It was built of old brick, its edges crumbling like the fractured memories within. The windows were thin, rattling with the faintest gust of wind, and the floors groaned underfoot as though they resented the weight of its inhabitants. Even the wallpaper, peeling at the edges, seemed to sigh with exhaustion. This was the stage of my childhood, a hollow husk masquerading as a home. I was 6 when my mother disappeared. That night still haunts me, etched into my mind with cruel precision. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and mildew, the kind of dampness that seemed to seep straight into your lungs. Outside, the wind howled, flinging branches against the window panes like skeletal fingers. Inside, it was quieter, but not silent, never silent. I'd been lying in bed, clutching a stuffed rabbit with threadbare ears, its once white fur now a dingy gray. My mother had sewn it for me. She wasn't much of a seamstress, but she had done her best, her fingers pricked and bleeding by the time she handed it to me, with a smile that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "To keep you safe," she'd whispered, pressing it into my arms. The rabbit still smelled faintly of hair, a mixture of lavender soap and something sweet, like vanilla. That scent lingered long after she was gone, haunting me. That night, I heard them arguing in the kitchen. Their voices were low, venomous, but every now and then a word would rise above the rest, sharp and cutting. "You think you're better than me," my father snarled. "I think I want out," she shot back, her voice trembling but defiant. "I can't live like this anymore. You're poison." I crept out of bed, the rabbit clutched tightly to my chest, and padded down the hallway. The old floorboards protested under my small feet, but the storm outside covered the noise. The door to the kitchen was ajar, and through the narrow gap I could see them. My mother, her face pale and streaked with tears, stood with her arms wrapped around herself, as though trying to shield herself from the venom my father spat at her. He loomed over her, his fists clenched, his face a mask of rage. "Go ahead," he said, his voice a low growl. "Leave. But you're not taking the boy." She glanced in my direction, her eyes meeting mine for the briefest moment. Something passed between us in that instant, a silent plea, a flicker of hope quickly extinguished. Then she turned away, shoulders slumping as if she'd already accepted defeat. The next morning, she was gone. My father didn't say a word about it. He burned her pictures in the fireplace, the flames devouring her smiling face until there was nothing left but ash. Her name was torn from family documents, scratched out as though she had never existed. When I asked where she'd gone, he looked at me with those cold, unfeeling eyes and said, "She didn't want us. She didn't want you." I believed him. I hated her for years because of it. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, doubts crept in. Had she really left? Or had he done something? My mother's face lingered in my memories like a ghost, her eyes always filled with sadness, her hands trembling as they brushed my hair. She wouldn't have left without saying goodbye, would she? Life with my father was a bleak monotony. He wasn't the kind of man who offered affection or guidance. He was a mechanic, working long hours in the garage, his hands perpetually stained with grease. When he wasn't working, he was drinking. The clink of bottles and the low hum of the television were the soundtrack to my evenings. Conversations were rare and, when they occurred, brief and biting. Still, I craved his attention. I thought if I could just do well enough, be good enough, he might notice me. Once, when I was 8, I brought home a school-projected diorama of a farm made from cardboard and paint. I'd spent hours on it, carefully crafting each tiny detail. When I showed it to him, my chest puffed with pride. He barely glanced at it. "Looks like shit," he muttered, taking a swig from his beer. "Don't waste your time on crap like that." His words hit me harder than any blow could have. I stood there, clutching the diorama, my face burning with shame. Later, I smashed it to pieces in the backyard, my hands shaking with anger and humiliation. That night, as I lay in bed, I whispered to the stuffed rabbit, imagining it was my mother listening. "Why did you leave me?" I asked. But the rabbit had no answers. Punishments were swift and merciless. A wrong word, a misplaced object, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could earn me a belting. The leather strap hung on a hook in the kitchen, a silent threat that needed no words. I learned to stay out of his way, to make myself invisible. But no matter how careful I was, the strap found me often enough to leave my back striped with welts and my spirit fractured. The house mirrored our lives cold, silent, and unwelcoming. The walls seemed to close in, oppressive and suffocating. The furniture was old, mismatched, and stained, each piece carrying its own history of neglect. The kitchen table was scarred with knife marks, the sofa sagged in the middle, and the carpet was threadbare, its patterns faded with time. Dust clung to every surface, as though the house itself had given up, trying to be anything other than a tomb. But it was in the small rebellions that I found fragments of solace. I'd sneak out to the overgrown garden, a wild tangle of weeds and forgotten flowers, and imagine it as a jungle or a battlefield. Sometimes, I'd climb the ancient oak tree at the edge of the yard, its gnarled branches a sanctuary where I could escape his watchful eye. Up there, with the wind in my hair and the world spread out below me, I felt free, if only for a little while. I also had imaginary friends, a group of loyal companions who lived in the shadows of my room. They had names, personalities, and stories all their own. They listened when no one else did, their silent presence a comfort in the endless void of loneliness. But even they couldn't fill the void left by my mother. Sometimes, late at night, I'd lie awake and listen to the house breathe. The creak of the floorboards, the whisper of the wind through the cracks, the faint hum of the refrigeratorette was a symphony of sorrow. I'd clutch the rabbit to my chest, its lavender vanilla scent faded but still there, and imagine she was coming back for me. That she'd walk through the door, scoop me up in her arms, and take me away from this place. But morning always came, and with it, the harsh reality that I was alone. My father's shadow loomed over everything, a constant reminder of what I could never escape. And yet, there were moments, fleeting and fragile, when I dared to hope. Hope that there was something more beyond the cold walls of that house. Hope that I could find her. Hope that, one day, I'd be free. But hope was a dangerous thing in a house like ours. It was a flame that could be snuffed out with a single word, a single blow. And as I grew older, I learned to bury it deep, where even he couldn't find it. Still, it burned. Chapter 2: Claire's Arrival. The rain came down in sheets that night, hammering against the windows and turning the world outside into a blur of gray streaks and shuddering shadows. I was sitting by the window in my room, the stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand, the other tracing lazy patterns on the condensation fogging the glass. The house groaned under the weight of the storm, each creak and moan sounding like a lament for something lost. Then I saw it. My father's car pulling into the driveway, headlights slicing through the rain. I didn't move at first, my breath fogging the glass as I watched the familiar black shape of the car come to a halt. He got out, slamming the door hard enough that it echoed even over the storm, and went around to the passenger side. That's when I saw her. She was small, much smaller than me, even though I was only 10 at the time. Her blonde hair was plastered to her face, and her tiny frame was trembling, though whether it was from cold or fear, I couldn't tell. My father dragged her out of the car, his hand gripping her wrist with a force that made me flinch. She stumbled, her feet bare against the gravel, but he didn't pause. He pulled her towards the house, his face set in that familiar scowl, the one that promised trouble for anyone who dared to defy him. I scrambled away from the window, my heart pounding. I didn't know who she was or why she was there, but instinctively I knew this wasn't right. Something about the way she looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with terror, made my stomach churn. The front door slammed open, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. I crept to the top of the stairs, peering down as my father shoved the girl inside. She stumbled, nearly falling, but caught herself on the edge of the hallway table. He towered over her, his presence as oppressive as the storm outside. "This is your new little sister," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Say hello." The girl's eyes darted around the room, landing on me for a brief moment before flickering away. She looked terrified, her small body trembling as she wrapped her arms around herself. I didn't move. I didn't speak. My throat felt like it was closing up, the words tangled somewhere deep inside me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice so soft I almost thought I imagined it. My father's hand lashed out, striking her across the face. The sound was sharp, cutting through the air like a whip. She crumpled to the floor, a sob escaping her lips. "Shut up," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll do as you're told, or you'll regret it." He grabbed her by the arm and hauled her to her feet, dragging her down the hallway toward the spare room. I heard the door slam, followed by the click of a lock. Her cries seeped through the walls, muffled but persistent, a haunting counterpoint to the storm outside. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as her sobs echoed in my ears. The rabbit was clutched tightly in my arms, its once comforting presence now a cruel reminder of how helpless I was. My father had made it clear long ago that defiance was met with swift and brutal punishment. The belt still hung on its hook in the kitchen, a silent warning that no one in this house was safe from his wrath. But still, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why was she here? My mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. The next morning, I found myself standing outside the spare room. The door was shut tight, the key nowhere to be seen. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, before stepping back. My father's words from the night before echoed in my head. "You stay out of that room. If I catch you talking to her, I'll bury you both." I believed him. I'd seen the fury in his eyes, felt the sting of his belt too many times to doubt his threats. But the sound of her sobs, faint but unmistakable, gnawed at me. I couldn't ignore it. Days turned into weeks. The girl, Claire, as I'd learned her name was, remained locked in the spare room. My father brought her food, though he never let me see him do it. Sometimes, I'd hear him yelling at her, his voice a harsh growl that made my skin crawl. Other times, there was only silence, the kind of silence that felt heavy, suffocating, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I tried to stay out of it, to keep my head down and avoid his wrath. But Claire's voice, weak and desperate, called to me. Whenever my father left for work, she'd whisper through the locked door, "Please, let me out. Please." At first, I ignored her. Fear held me in its grip. A cold hand wrapped around my throat. But her pleas grew weaker with each passing day, and something inside me began to crack. The guilt was unbearable, a weight pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The house was silent, my father snoring loudly in his room. I crept down the hallway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake him. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the knob. "It's okay," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to her or myself. The lock clicked open, the sound startling in the oppressive quiet. I pushed the door open slowly, my breath catching as I saw her curled up on the floor. She looked smaller than ever, her blonde hair matted, her face pale and hollow. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something other than fear in them. "Hope." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I helped her to her feet, my hands trembling as I guided her out of the room. But before we could reach the kitchen, a shadow loomed over us. My father. He was standing at the end of the hallway, his face contorted with a fury I had never seen before. His eyes burned with an unnatural intensity, veins bulging in his neck as his fists clenched at his sides. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared, his voice shaking the walls. Before I could answer, he lunged at me. His hand struck the side of my head, and I stumbled, the world spinning as I fell. My head hit the floor with a sickening crack, and pain exploded behind my eyes. I heard Claire scream, a piercing sound that was swallowed by the darkness overtaking me. When I woke, the house was eerily quiet. My head throbbed, the pain sharp and unrelenting. I pushed myself up, my vision swimming, and stumbled to the window. Outside, my father was standing by a barrel in the garden, the flames inside casting flickering shadows across his face. He was feeding something into the fire's small, tattered pieces of fabric. Claire's clothes. The acrid scent of burning fabric reached my nose, mingling with the dampness of the morning air. My stomach twisted as I watched him, the smell of something sickly sweet wafting through the cracked window. He turned, his face hard and unyielding, and caught sight of me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he smiled, a cold, joyless curve of his lips. "She's gone," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "She ran off. Didn't even look back. Said she couldn't stand you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was lying, but my throat felt like it had closed up. I sank back onto the floor, the room spinning as his words echoed in my mind. He turned back to the fire, his hands methodically feeding the flames, and I realized with chilling clarity that I'd seen this before. Years ago, when he'd burned my mother's picture, when he'd erased her from our lives. And now he was doing it again. The flames danced higher, illuminating his face in eerie flashes. His eyes reflected the firelight, cold and unfeeling. I watched him until I couldn't anymore, the pain in my head overwhelming me as tears blurred my vision. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that nothing would ever be the same again. We left the house shortly after the night with Claire. My father never explained why, and I never dared to ask. He simply packed our meager belongings into his car one damp morning, his face stony and unreadable, and we drove away, leaving behind the cold walls and the memories that clung to them. It was the start of a year that felt like a lifetime, a year of wandering. We never stayed in one place for long. A few months here, a few months there. Each house we rented was more isolated than the last, tucked away at the end of long rutted driveways or hidden behind thick stands of trees. They were the kind of places where silence reigned supreme, where even the creak of a floorboard felt intrusive. My father's presence filled those spaces, heavy and stifling. He never brought anyone to the house. He didn't speak of anyone. To the outside world, it was as though we didn't exist at all. School became a thing of the past. When my mother disappeared, my father told the authorities I would be homeschooled, but it was just another lie in a long list of them. My lessons were whatever I could piece together from outdated books and my own wandering thoughts. My father didn't seem to care if I learned anything or not. He had other priorities, dark, unknowable priorities that hung over us like a storm cloud. One thing that stands out from that year is the routine. No matter where we moved, there was always a pattern. The days began with my father leaving the house early and returning late. His hands were often stained with oil and grime, though he didn't always smell like the garage where he claimed to work. He spoke little, his silence like a wall between us. But it was his eyes that unsettled me most, dark and restless, always scanning the room as though he expected something to leap out at him. The nights were worse. The isolation of those houses pressed in on me, the silence amplified by the vast emptiness of the places we called home. I'd lie awake in the dark, clutching the stuffed rabbit my mother had made for me, and listen to the sounds of the house. The groan of settling beams, the occasional drip of a leaky faucet, and other sounds. I'd hear faint cries sometimes, high and mournful, like the wail of an injured animal. At first, I thought they were coming from outside, carried on the wind. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became that the sounds were coming from inside the house. Once, I crept out of bed and followed the noise, my heart pounding with every step. I made it as far as the basement door before I froze. The cries stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before retreating to my room, my imagination spinning wild tales that I didn't want to believe. In those moments, I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. The isolation, the constant moving, the strange noises that seemed to follow us from house to house, it was enough to make anyone question their sanity. My father never acknowledged the sounds, and I never dared to ask. He had a way of looking at me, sharp and unyielding, that made my words die in my throat. Then there were the barrels. Every house we stayed in had one. Sometimes they were already there, rusting and forgotten in the corner of a yard. Other times, my father brought his own. He used them often, always in the dead of night. I'd see him from my bedroom window, standing by the barrel with his back to me, feeding it scraps of fabric, stacks of paper, and other things I couldn't make out. The flames would flare high, casting long shadows across the yard, and the smell of burning would seep into my room no matter how tightly I shut the windows. Once, I worked up the courage to ask him what he was burning. "Things we don't need anymore," he said curtly, his tone brooking no further questions. His words should have been innocuous, but there was something in his voice that made my skin crawl. One night, I couldn't help myself. I waited until the flames had died down and the yard was silent. Then I crept outside, my breath fogging in the cold air, and peered into the barrel. The ashes were still warm, and among them, I saw fragments that didn't make sense. A button, half melted. The edge of something that looked like bone, though I told myself it couldn't be. The acrid smell clung to me as I backed away, my chest tight with fear. The nights grew heavier as the year wore on. I began to see shadows in the corners of rooms where there shouldn't have been any. I'd hear footsteps at odd hours, soft and deliberate, though my father was asleep. I tried to tell myself it was the creak of an old house settling, the trick of an overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew better. The worst was the crying. It came more frequently as time passed, faint and distant, but always there if I listened closely enough. Sometimes it sounded like a child. Other times it was something else low and guttural, filled with pain. I'd lie in bed, my hands pressed to my ears, trying to drown it out. But it wasn't just the sounds that haunted me. It was the way they seemed to seep into my dreams, twisting them into nightmares that left me gasping for air when I woke. I began to wonder if the crying was real or just in my mind. It felt like the house was alive, feeding on my fear, warping reality until I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. I stopped trusting my senses, stopped trusting myself. And in the silence that followed the cries, I always felt the same thing, eyes watching me from the dark. We had moved to another state, another nameless place that felt as empty and temporary as all the others. The days bled into each other, filled with the same oppressive silence, the same uneasy rhythms that defined our lives. But then came the day my father told me I was going for a drive with him. It wasn't a suggestion. He never asked me to do anything. He commanded, and I obeyed. His voice had that edge to it, the one that made my stomach twist. I didn't ask why. I just climbed into the car, the leather seat cold and stiff beneath me. He slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the stillness, and turned to look at me. There was something in his eyes that I didn't recognize, a manic light that made me shift uncomfortably. "Today," he said, his grin sharp and unpleasant, "we're going to make a man out of you. No more Nancy boy nonsense." I didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. His words felt like a challenge, a dare that I didn't want to accept. I nodded mutely, my hands gripping the edge of my seat as he started the engine. The car growled to life, and we pulled out of the driveway, the tires crunching over gravel. The drive felt aimless at first. We cruised through the city, the world outside the window a blur of movement and noise. My father was quiet, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his eyes constantly scanning the streets. There was a tension in him, a coiled energy that made the air in the car feel heavy. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, trying to make sense of his mood. He looked like a predator, his head swiveling, his gaze darting from one face to the next. It was as though he was hunting for something, though I couldn't imagine what. The rain started just after noon, a light drizzle at first, that soon turned into a steady downpour. The wipers squeaked rhythmically against the windshield, their sound grating against my nerves. My father's mood darkened with the weather. He muttered to himself under his breath, low words that I couldn't quite catch. His hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white with strain. Then I saw her. She was standing on the sidewalk, huddled beneath the awning of a rundown convenience store. The rain had plastered her hair to her face, and her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her thin frame. She couldn't have been more than 18. She looked lost, vulnerable, and something about her caught my father's attention. He slowed the car, his lips curling into a strange, unpleasant smile. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and sharp. He got out of the car without waiting for my response, slamming the door behind him. I watched as he approached the girl, my breath fogging up the window as I leaned closer. He was saying something to her, gesturing with his hands, but I couldn't hear the words over the rain. She looked hesitant, glancing around nervously, but then she nodded. My father put a hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the car. My heart started to pound. The door opened, and the girl climbed in, her eyes darting toward me before quickly looking away. She smelled like rain and cigarettes, the scent filling the small space. My father got back in and started the car, his grin wider now, more menacing. "We're going to have a little party," he said, his voice light and mocking. He glanced at the girl in the rearview mirror. "If you're good enough to make a man out of my boy here, I'll double your fee." I didn't understand everything he said, but I understood enough. My face burned with shame and confusion, my hands gripping the seat so tightly that my knuckles ached. I stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the girl, refusing to look at him. My heart was racing, my thoughts spinning out of control. Was this real? Was this actually happening? Or was it just another trick of my mind? Another sign that I was losing my grip on reality? The lines between what was real and what wasn't had been blurring for so long that I couldn't tell anymore. The rain beat against the car, loud and relentless, as we drove back toward the house. My father was talking, his voice a constant stream of words that I couldn't focus on. He sounded almost cheerful, as though this was all some kind of game to him. I wanted to scream, to tell him to stop the car, to let the girl go. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was like I was frozen, trapped in my own body, watching the scene unfold like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The girl didn't say much. She sat quietly in the back seat, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes fixed on the window. I wondered what she was thinking, if she was as scared as I was. She must have been. How could she not be? When we pulled into the driveway, my father turned to me, his grin still plastered across his face. "Time to grow up, boy," he said, his tone mocking and cruel. The girl looked at me then, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. There was something in her gaze, something desperate and pleading that made my stomach twist. I wanted to help her, to do something, anything, but I didn't know how. I was just a kid, just a scared, powerless kid. What I thought was fear in her eyes now seems different in hindsight. There was a spark there, something sharp and deliberate, not fear excitement. I didn't understand it then, but the memory claws at me now, years later, with a meaning I can't shake. When she stepped into our house, she didn't hesitate. Her voice cut through the stale air as she turned to my father and asked, "Do the girls enjoy your parties?" Her tone was sweet, almost innocent, but there was a weight to the words that hung heavy in the room. My father froze for a moment, confused, and then he laughed. A loud, booming laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't understand, not yet. And I remember thinking for the first time that maybe I was the crazy one, that maybe none of it was real, and the madness I saw in my father's eyes was just a reflection of the madness in my own mind. The girl was barely bigger than me, but there was something about her that seemed to grow as she stood in the dim light of our living room. Her confidence, her presence, filled the space in a way that made it hard to breathe. She wasn't trembling or hesitant like I thought she might be. Instead, she stood tall, her eyes fixed on my father with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "Why do you hate little girls and women?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. There was no fear in it, no hesitation. She didn't shout or raise her voice. She just asked the question as though it were the most natural thing in the world, like someone asking if you wanted milk with your coffee. Matter-of-factly. The effect on my father was instantaneous. His face twisted into a mask of rage, his eyes narrowing as though he couldn't quite believe what he'd just heard. For a moment, I thought he might just laugh it off, but then his hand shot out. The slap landed with a crack that echoed through the room, sharp and brutal. He'd used the back of his hand, and the force of it was staggering. It wasn't just a slap. It was an explosion of everything he held inside. The hate, the anger, the twisted power he carried like a second skin. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. But the girl, she didn't flinch. She didn't fall. She didn't cry. She stood there, her head tilted slightly to one side, her eyes never leaving his. A faint red mark bloomed on her cheek, but she didn't raise a hand to touch it. She just stared at him, and then, in a voice that was soft but laced with something sharp and cutting, she said, "Is that all you've got, big man? Is this why you target little girls and women?" The room seemed to freeze. My father, who was usually so quick to roar, so quick to lash out again, just stood there, his chest heaving. His hand hovered in the air, as though he were deciding whether to strike her again. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, not with fear, but with something closer to pity. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was glued to the scene, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. My father had always been the predator, the one who held all the power in the room. But now, with this girl standing in front of him, I saw something I'd never seen before: doubt. He recovered quickly, his face twisting into a sneer. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You don't know anything about me." The girl took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "I know enough," she said, her voice steady. "I know what men like you do. I know how you hide behind your strength, your anger, because deep down, you're just a coward. That's all you are, a pathetic coward." My father's hand twitched, and for a moment, I thought he might hit her again. But he didn't. He just stared at her, his face pale and drawn, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. I'd never seen him like this before. He looked small, almost fragile, and it terrified me more than his rage ever had. The girl turned to me then, her gaze softening. "Go to your room," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't need to see this." I hesitated, looking between her and my father. He looked at me too, his eyes narrowing, and I felt the familiar weight of his control pressing down on me. But then the girl spoke again, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Go," she repeated, and this time I obeyed. I scrambled up the stairs, my legs shaking beneath me, and closed the door to my room. I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to hear what was happening below. Their voices were muffled, but I could still catch fragments of the conversation. Her words were steady and relentless, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. His were louder, angrier, but there was something else in them too, something that sounded like desperation. I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't know who this girl was, or why she had come into our lives. But as I sat there, my back pressed against the door, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Downstairs, the storm was brewing. But for the first time, it wasn't just my father who held the thunder. The sounds that followed were unlike anything I'd ever heard. There was a crash, the unmistakable clatter of furniture being overturned, and then a sharp, guttural yell that sent a shiver through my entire body. It wasn't a scream of anger or dominance. It was a sound of anguish. And it wasn't hers. It was his. I pressed myself harder against the door, my ears straining to catch every noise. Another crash, louder this time, and the sound of glass shattering. My father's voice roared, but it was broken, uneven, like a wild animal cornered and panicked. Then came the screams. They ripped through the house, sharp and jagged, and my breath hitched as I realized they weren't the screams of a woman or a little girl. They were my father's, deep and raw, filled with a kind of pain I'd never imagined he could feel. I heard the dull thud of something heavy hitting the floor, followed by a scuffling sound. The girl's voice rose again, calm and steady, but I couldn't make out the words. My father's reply was a garbled mess of rage and fear, his usual bravado stripped away. There was another crash, and then silence thick and suffocating, like the house itself was holding its breath. I sat there, my heart hammering in my chest, unsure if I was more terrified of what I'd already heard or what might come next. There was a gentle knock on my bedroom door. I tried to ignore it, burying my head under the pillow and willing it to stop, but it wouldn't go away. Then I heard my name, soft and lilting, spoken in a voice that sounded just like my mother's. It was full of tender love and warmth, the kind of voice that could make you believe everything would be okay. I couldn't resist. My legs felt weak as I swung them over the side of the bed and shuffled to the door, my steps unsteady. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned the handle, half hoping to see my mother standing there. Instead, it was the girl. She stood in the doorway, her expression calm, her eyes steady and piercing. "Come with me," she said, her voice just as gentle as the one that had called my name. She reached out and took my hand, her touch light but firm. It reminded me of how my mother used to hold my hand when I was small, her fingers a soft reassurance against the chaos of the world. The memory made my throat tighten. Without a word, the girl smiled faintly and whispered, "Close your eyes." I hesitated, but her tone left no room for argument. I closed my eyes, and she began to lead me. Her steps were careful, measured, as if she knew I would falter without her guidance. The air felt heavier as we descended the stairs, the creak of the wood beneath our feet seeming louder than it should have been. My chest tightened with every step, the uncertainty gnawing at me. I didn't know where she was taking me, but some part of me was too afraid to ask. I could still hear the echo of my father's screams in my mind, raw and unnatural, and I wondered if she could hear them too. She walked me outside the house and sat with me on the steps, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. Her voice was calm, almost soothing, as she began to speak. "Your father won't hurt you or anyone else ever again," she said, her words carrying a certainty that left no room for doubt. "And your mother," she added softly, "loved you more than anything. She didn't choose to leave you. That was the doing of the monster that fathered you." Her words cut through me like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. The truth in them was undeniable, and yet it felt like my mind couldn't fully grasp it. My father a monster. It seemed so obvious now, but in that moment, it was like my brain was fighting to catch up with a reality I had been too afraid to face. I don't remember much more of what she said. Her voice became a hum in the background, like a lullaby, sung from some distant place. I remember staring down at my hands, noticing for the first time how small they were, how powerless they looked. I felt like a child again, lost and confused, even as the truth began to unfurl in my mind like a dark, poisonous flower. Then the police arrived. Their flashing lights painted the street in hues of red and blue, the wail of their sirens cutting through the quiet of the night. I was still sitting on the steps when they found me, my legs curled beneath me like a scared animal. One of them crouched down to my level, his face kind but lined with concern. "Are you okay, son?" he asked, his voice soft but probing. I tried to answer, but the words felt stuck in my throat. I wanted to tell him about the young woman, about how my father had brought her to the house, about how she had saved me. But when I looked around, she was gone. Vanished. There was no trace of her anywhere. Inside the house, they found my father's body. He was slumped in the living room, his face frozen in an expression I couldn't describe. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pain. It was something else entirely, something unnatural, as though he had seen something no human was ever meant to see. The police pieced together their own version of the story. They said he must have picked up a working girl who, with the help of accomplices, had robbed and killed him. But their theory didn't make sense. His wallet was still in his pocket, untouched. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone else in the house. And what kind of working girl could overpower a man like my father so completely? The idea was laughable, absurd. Yet they clung to it because it was the only explanation they could find. Later, when I provided the police with what little information I could, they began to connect the dots. My father's name came up in case after case, missing person after missing person. Women and girls who had disappeared without a trace, their lives snuffed out like candles in a storm. They found enough evidence to close multiple cases, but the full extent of his crimes, I don't think anyone will ever know. Not completely. And then there was her. How had she known my father's secret? How had she known my name? And how had she beaten a man like him twice her size without so much as breaking a sweat? I replayed those questions in my mind over and over, but no answers came. The only thing I knew for certain was that she wasn't just some working girl. She couldn't have been. She was something else entirely. An avenging angel, perhaps. Or maybe something darker, something the world wasn't meant to understand. All I know is that she saved me. And then she disappeared, leaving nothing behind but the truth she had forced me to see, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that my father's reign of terror was finally over. Epilogue. It's been 10 years since that night, and the events still live in my mind like shadows that refuse to fade. They creep into the quiet moments, slithering through the cracks in my thoughts, twisting memories into accusations. No matter how far I've tried to run from that house, from my father's monstrous legacy, it's always there waiting. Some nights, I wake in a cold sweat, my heart pounding as though I'm still that terrified boy, standing on the stairs with my ear pressed to the door, listening to the chaos below. I hear his screams in my dreams, raw and unnatural, echoing in the cavernous void of my mind. But it's not just his voice that haunts me. It's hers, too. The girl's calm, relentless words, the certainty in her eyes as she tore him down without lifting a finger. I've spent a decade asking myself questions I'll never find answers to. What if I'd stood up for my mother? What if I'd told someone what my father was doing, what he was? Could I have stopped him before it went so far? Before he destroyed so many lives? Maybe. Maybe not. But the guilt doesn't care about maybes. It clings to me, heavy and suffocating, whispering that I'm just as much to blame as he was. Am I? That's the question I can never escape. I was just a child, powerless and terrified, but does that absolve me? Does it erase the weight of all the lives he took? The women, the girls, who will never come home because I didn't. I couldn't stop him. Their faces, imagined and indistinct, float through my mind like ghosts, tethered to my scale of justice. And the scales tip further every day. The worst thought of all, the one I can barely bring myself to confront, is the fear that I might turn out like him. What if it's in me? What if his darkness runs through my veins, waiting for its moment to surface? I try to tell myself it's not true, that I'm nothing like him, but the doubt lingers. He must have been good once, mustn't he? My mother wouldn't have fallen in love with a monster. She must have seen something in him, some spark of kindness or charm, before it was swallowed by the darkness. If he could become what he was, could I? I've tried to build a life away from it all. I've moved to places where no one knows my name, where my father's crimes are nothing more than a distant headline in an old newspaper. I've tried to forget, to pretend that I'm just another face in the crowd. But forgetting is impossible. Every mirror I pass shows me his shadow. Every time I catch my reflection, I see his jawline, his eyes, staring back at me, daring me to believe that I can escape him. I've wondered about the girl 1,000 times. Who was she, really? How did she know about my father, about what he'd done? How did she know my name, and what was she? No ordinary girl could have done what she did that night, standing up to him with a confidence that was almost inhuman. No ordinary girl could have left without a trace, as though she'd never been there at all. Was she an avenging angel, sent to deliver justice where it was long overdue? Or was she something darker, something beyond human comprehension? I'll never know. And that thought eats away at me, just as much as everything else. I've spent years trying to atone for sins that aren't mine, but the weight doesn't lessen. I volunteer at shelters, donate to causes for women and children, anything to tip the scales back toward balance. But it's never enough. How could it be? No act of kindness can undo the horrors my father unleashed. No amount of good can erase the shadow he left behind. So I live with it. I carry it with me, every day, every night, because I have no choice. My father may be gone, but his ghost is alive and well, and it lives in me. It's in every question I ask, every decision I make, every shadow I see lurking in the corner of my eye. It whispers that I'll never be free of him, that no matter how hard I try, I'll never outrun what he was, what he made me. But I'll keep trying. For my mother, for the women he hurt, for myself. Maybe one day I'll finally tip the scales. Maybe one day I'll find peace. But for now, the shadows remain.
If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like and subscribe. There's a new tale waiting for you every day.